talk about the process of industrialization in Japan to elaborate on what we read in class today. One of the most important elements of industrialization in Japan was the Meiji Restoration. Remember, under Emperor Meiji, who took out the shogun and started westernizing? So as a reaction to the opening of Japan to Western influences, the samurai revolted against the shogun, often in the form of attacking foreigners. And there's a civil war ensues, and Emperor Meiji is restored to power. So this is the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, in which the emperor was merely a figurehead and did not have political power. When Emperor Meiji steps up, the emperor resumes a political role. The first change that's made under Emperor Meiji is that feudalism is abolished. And that the power of the state is expanded to create economic and social change. Remember, in a feudal system, it's very hard to instigate change because so many people are tied to the land and only answer to the person above them. The shogun, or the ruler at the top, does not actually have very much power or control. A new constitution and a new parliament is set up, called the Diet. So we have a balance of powers to some extent. And Emperor Meiji centralized rule and advisors combined with limited representative institutions. So there's some representation, though Emperor Meiji keeps the majority of power. Meiji westernization occurred since Japan was forced to open its doors to the West by Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States. So there's a new era of Japanese westernization where industrialization begins, education, etc. So if the shogunate was ended over the opening of Japan to Western influence, why do you think the Meiji emperor would choose to pursue westernization? Hopefully you understood from the reading yesterday and today that Japan adopted, if you can't beat them, join them philosophy, since they weren't able militarily to defeat the Western forces. It was also an effort to protect Japan from being overrun by Western powers. They saw what happened in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, so their neighbors were being overrun by Western powers, where Japan felt if they worked with the Western forces and adopted Western ways, they may be able to be an equal player rather than a dominated nation. So this is the end of the samurai era. Again, since the samurai were a class who were trained militarily, and Japan didn't really need them at this point. They were outdated, didn't have guns, etc. Samurai instead are sent to Western Europe, to the United States, to study political and economic developments and technology. So many of the samurai took up higher class jobs as businessmen, as politicians, etc., rather than their ritualistic military position. So the samurai class of the feudal era is abolished, and there's a samurai uprising in 1877. If you've ever seen the movie The Last Samurai, this is what it discusses. And the army is based on required service, kept the country militarily secure. So all men, instead of having a samurai class, all men were required to serve in the military for a time. So think about your reading, and how does the experience of Iwasaki Yotaro represent an opportunity for samurai to adapt to change? You might need to look back in your notes to write down an answer. So, Japan had its own industrial revolution, in which the modern army and navy are established with the help of Western advisors. Keep in mind, in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese had the help of the strongest navy in the world, the British. New banks, railroads, steamships, and agricultural methods set the stage for industrialization. So Japan westernizes in its commerce, in its railroads, in its technology, and is ready to industrialize. But again, these features need to be in place before industrialization of industry is possible. So at first, industry is state-sponsored, so paid for by the government, but eventually private ownership increased over time as the merchant and middle class grow. Japan, though, still relies on imports of Western equipment, such as steamships and engines and raw materials, so still Japan is dependent on the world market. They cannot operate on their own. Let's compare Japan and Russia, because they are both nations that industrialized in the wake of Western influences. So like Russia, Japan's industrialization is directed by the state. So it's top-down process. There's not a large merchant class to be funding this industrialization. Unlike Russia, however, Japan maintained a more watchful eye over foreign investment and was very leery of Western forces. They didn't want to lose their culture, and they didn't want to become a colony like the Philippines, for example. Also, Japan's political and social structure changed greatly. If you remember, in Russia, only the upper class was really westernized and industrialized, and there was still a very, very large peasant population. Whereas in Japan, the political and social structure was greatly altered. The feudal system was abolished. We shift from a shogunate to an emperor, etc. So other effects of industrialization, there's steady population growth, again, more consistency of food, a wider variety of foods, more jobs, people have more money, etc. Universal education system emphasized love of country, respect of superiors, so it kept people in line while still educating and making the country stronger. So there's great filial piety in Japan, again, respect for your elders. And there's a shift in foreign policy. We end our 17th century isolation edict, closing out Christianity, etc., especially since our upper class becomes more secular, more Confucianist, not so worried about Buddhism. And Japan actually starts to set its sights on imperializing, because now as they industrialize, they're going to need more raw materials. So Japan is going to look around at its neighbors and see who might be weak and who could be imperialized. Take a look at this chart and go ahead and write down an interpretation. Pretend this is a document in a DBQ. So don't just show what's happening, show what it might mean, the significance of it. And think about what coal is used for. Go ahead and take a look at this cartoon. Analyze this cartoon. Who do you think is the big warrior? Who is the little warrior? It's a bit cut off, but the text at the bottom says Jap, the giant killer. So Japanese imperialism, again, just like Europe, the more industrialized a nation becomes, the more it needs access to markets to sell its products to and to raw materials to put into production. So why is Japan so desperate for raw materials? Go ahead and answer that question based on your reading. So one place Japan is going to look to get raw materials is its big neighbor, China, the giant. So that's what the cartoon is representing. It's Japan attempting to take on China, the giant China. Remember Sino-Japanese War with signification? It's the prefix that means China. So at this time, China is greatly weak. It's after the Opium Wars. After China has been greatly exploited, and as we talked about yesterday, they're in a period of political turmoil and the dynastic decline. So it's actually quite easy for little Japan to take over areas of China. Then there is the Russo-Japanese War, which we studied earlier this week, in which Japan was able to defeat Russia with the help of the British and the British Navy. So at this point, Japan is really demonstrating its power in East Asia, especially against the two very large opponents, China and Japan. Go ahead and analyze this cartoon. Everyone's labeled for you, but why might Russia look the way it does? Why does Japan look the way it does? Who's maybe in each corner? What do they represent? And notice the quotes at the bottom. Here we have a piece of propaganda from Japan. So as Japan sees greater successes in its battles with the great Asian or East Asian powers, nationalism increases, so the pride in the nation. And nationalism in Japan is based on a sense of superiority over other nations, which they're able to prove with their military, and a sense of unity and structure in both political and social life. So again, that education that the Japanese are receiving, saying that, you know, the service to the country is the most important, really feeds into this nationalist idea. There is respect and admiration for rulers. Again, this feeds into Japanese tradition, as well as this education where there is respect for your elders, etc. And there's also an emphasis on duty and obedience. A lot of this nationalism still exists today, but the idea of serving your nation as more important than serving yourself is very much present. I didn't answer the everybody writes question. Why was Japan able to avoid revolution after industrialization, but Russia was not? So a reminder, in Russia, after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, there was the revolution of 1905 with Bloody Sunday. It wasn't successful because the revolutionaries were so divided in their goals, but there was a successful revolution in 1917, which we saw in the video, a result of Russia floundering in World War I. So think about those things when you think about the context of Japan able to avoid revolution, and then also think about internal factors. So not just wars, etc., but also the way the government's structured, social structure, culture, etc. Please bring these notes with you tomorrow for class, and have a nice night.